Here comes YouTube. From Dallas, the latest from our daily newsletter at podnews.net. YouTube appears to be rolling out YouTube podcasts in the US. Available from the Explore page, the podcast front page contains popular episodes, playlists, and recommendations. Then a list of creators and categories like true crime, sports, and music. It's unclear how shows have been chosen. NBC News bulletins appear in the list for some reason, and Pod News doesn't. It's only available in the US. It's still rolling out to users, and we share more information about it in our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. Kai Chuck, YouTube's Director of Podcasting, will be speaking at Podcast Movement on Thursday. We've reached out to YouTube's PR team for comment, but have heard nothing back. Apple Podcasts has announced a number of changes to the platform's RSS feed requirements in 2023. The big technical change: no more email addresses in RSS feeds, a welcome change which will dramatically reduce the amount of spam sent to podcasters. Other technical changes include support of eTag and last modified, and the company has also announced changes to how podcast approval will work. In 2023, you'll instantly get into the Apple Podcasts directory as soon as you submit a show. It'll be available in search and recommendations after approval, though. And Spotify has put the company's new podcast ad experience live in their app. Chris Messina has captured and posted what it looks like on a podcast with multiple advertisers, giving the listener a set of links for the ads that they heard. Ads open in a web view, which could mean that Spotify can monitor the actions taken by the listener. Now, how useful would YouTube podcasts be for the podcast business? Studio 71 has told Pod News that the company's simulcast strategy, simultaneously releasing more than 100 shows on YouTube and podcast, has led to the company doubling its podcast audience in 2022, with total streams up by 118% year on year. Zencastr has launched what they call the first end-to-end video podcast platform. The service now records 4K video, allows you to edit it, host, and distribute it to major platforms, including Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. We've asked for more details about that because Spotify only supports video podcasts through Anchor, and Google Podcasts, doesn't support video podcasts at all. PodOps is to become a podcast hosting platform. PodOps hosting will include third-party audience and data integration, sponsorship management tools, and more. Tracking and analytics website Podkite has added an API. Its free linking website Kite Links has also rebuilt its website front page, supports embedded videos, timestamps, and YouTube links. We'll link to the Pod News Kite link and one for today's episode page from our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. Megaphone's integration with Podsights and Chartable will happen on September the 19th, according to the company's website. The company's announcement earlier this week just said September. The Irish Podcast Awards will take place on Friday, the 16th of September, in Dublin's Liberty Hall. Tickets are on sale now. Canada's Global News has published a piece about how podcasts have become misinformation machines. The story quotes Joe Rogan and Alex Jones, and nothing new, to be honest. In Sweden, Logcast, a social network for audio creators, has signed Johanna Nordstrom and Edvin Tornblom, the hosts of popular comedy podcast Ursakta. And Pod News' editor, James Cridland, that's me, is interviewed in this week's podcast, The Newsletter, from Lauren Purcell. This podcast is brought to you by The Podcast Broker. Just like businesses get bought and sold, so can podcasts. Your podcast has value, but if you want to sell it, along with its assets like websites, domains, social media, and email lists, The Podcast Broker can help get your podcast a new home for a great price. Launched today at Podcast Movement, The Podcast Broker is the first marketplace for buying or selling podcasts. You'll deal directly with the buyer, and The Podcast Broker will help ensure a seamless experience for your listeners. The Podcast Broker will take you through every step: evaluations, due diligence, legal contracts, and even assist with transitioning your audience. Get your free podcast evaluation from The Podcast Broker at thepodcastbroker.com. And in People News, congratulations to Corey Layton, head of digital audio at ARN's iHeart Podcast Network Australia, for winning the Radio Today Executive Leader of the Year. And in podcast news, Russian Resistance is a new podcast. An email comes in saying, "We want to show that the Russian anti-war movement actually exists and share the voices of those who support it. It seems important to us to talk about the situation in Russia on behalf of those who oppose the war. We believe that public awareness of the topic helps the resistance movement, which is slowly but diligently fighting the Putin regime." Caffeine, the social broadcasting company, has partnered with Checking In with Big U to produce video versions of the podcast 2 weeks before they release on other podcast platforms. The show features LA street legend and entrepreneur Eugene Big U Henley as he invites his A-list friends from across the culture to sit down for in-depth, unfiltered conversations. Snoop Dogg stars on the first episode of the new partnership. Pop culture, dating nightmares and true crime podcast My Worst Date has launched a bonus show called Double Dates, which will feature guests from other podcasts talking about their dating history. And Global has announced that The News Agents is the name of a new daily podcast from Emily Maitlis and John Sopel and Lewis Goodall. It's produced by Persephonica, the podcast company founded by Dino Sophos, and will launch on August the 30th. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.